Okay, so if first thing we got to look at there is if a rock wool is draining slowly, the main reason for that more than likely is your root mass hasn't been developed. So the plant is just not able to pull that water out. Because if you don't have the root mass and you're just waiting for perspirate or transpiration to occur, like just from the rock wool itself, just off letting the water out of it, that's going to take forever. So really, we're relying on the plant's roots to be able to pull that water out of there. If that's going slow, like I said, it's because the root mass hasn't caught up to the volume or the volume of the rock wool that you have. And so is it more effective to adjust irrigation timing or irrigation volume? That is completely dependent on what stage of growth you're in. So if you are in stretch, for example, you're trying to stack EC, I would say volume is going to be more important. It's going to be actually a mixture of both, but volume is going to be more important there because it's better to run your block dry at that point. It's better to prevent us hitting field capacity, which means we are going to cut out total volume given so that we don't actually reach field capacity with our P1s. That's going to cause the substrate to stay drier. It's also going to allow more oxygen in there. The less water that's placed in there, the more the more room for oxygen that can get in there. So if that's a scenario, that's how I would do that. If you're in any other situation, I mean, the only time that I would ever not do that is if I'm not trying to stack EC. Like if I am trying to keep things flushed out, I'm trying to keep, at least manage my 20 to 30% runoff per day to keep my EC down in a manageable area, but I'm not drying back like I need to. That's a time when I would go over time. I would just wait it out, watch my sensors, and if I got to cut out my irrigations for a day, I would do that. Typically, though, the only time that you're really going to run into that scenario would be after stretch if you are, crop steering and trying to steer vegetatively in like bulk of flower. And at that point, if your roots are not caught up to the rock wool then, and you're not able to dry back, I would say a minimum of 10 to 15%, which is usually where you should be at vegetative steering by that point, like week 4. Something went wrong in the first 3 weeks, and you're going to have to now abandon essentially the traditional crop steering model and play catch up, right? Because if your root mass is already 4 weeks in, for example, where you're trying to keep your EC low, you're trying to promote that that runoff and drainage, and you're just not able to drink 10 to 15% overnight by that point. You've got undeveloped root mass, you have oxygenation issues. Now we need to prioritize that time at that point. Hopefully that makes sense. Otherwise, though, I'm going to almost always cut my volume because this situation here is I can't say always, but it's almost always going to be limited to the first 3 weeks of flower when you've just transplanted a young plant into your rock wool and it just hasn't really blown out its roots yet to really take up that substrate. So best way to collect runoff is always going to be a tray of some sort. Typically you can use any type of saucer with a riser and just pull the plant off real quick and then stick your pen in. That's the traditional way of doing it. There is other options now. There's a company, I don't remember the exact name, but they make specifically like little square trays that you can set your blocks or bags on, and they actually have a little trench inside of them that drains the water in. So then all you got to do is just come up and just stick your pen in. It's like just big enough to soak the membrane. And those are pretty cool. I haven't tried those yet, but that's an easy way to do it. That's going to give you a per plant view, right? Like if you're just looking at, okay, this specific plant, that's all you're getting. However, if you want to get a holistic view of what's going on, you need to capture the runoff from that whole table, like all the plants coming down and try to grab an average from that. And there's ways to do that as well. You can either have your runoff go into a basin before it gets flushed out and drained, and then a lot of people will have a basin and they'll put a sump pump in with an auto drain on it or something to where they have a reservoir of that total runoff. Or something that I've been doing recently is you can actually set a P-trap on the drain line. So like all your drain lines come into a single P-trap for that table, and you can actually drill in 2 holes and put low pressure pH and EC probes into them using like those watertight fittings. And because it's a P-trap, it's always holding nutrients in there so it doesn't mess up your pH probes. And then you can kind of get a live view reported using like one of our batch tank links or something where you can actually see what a small sample of the total cumulated runoff vitals are for that table. So there's kind of multiple ways to do that. Some people also will take a syringe even and stab it inside the rock wool and pull it out from the root zone. That's also possible too. I don't like doing that, but some people do that as well. So you got a lot of options there. Those are probably the best ones I would recommend though. I mean, anytime you get into nutrient deficiencies in plant recovery, there's not a straightforward answer. I mean, I'll give you my best here, but there's never going to be a straightforward answer just due to the specific genetic, how strong it is, and how resistant to stress it is. Because nutrient deficiency is a stress. Because if you're growing in cocoa or rockwool and you're running salts, which I'm assuming you are at that point, you should get a correction. Well, that's the thing is leaves are never going to fix themselves. Once damage is done to a leaf or to the plant, it's never going to just all of a sudden heal. You know, those leaves are never going to recover, but you can stop it from getting worse, and then you can move forward and so that all new future growth is unaffected by it and it's healthy again. So because you're in hydroponics, meaning you're not in an organic living soil or anything like that, you should get a correction immediately. The problem will stop getting worse immediately. The damage to the leaves will already be done, and that might move into further necrosis or whatever, but your future, all the new growth, the new tips, everything is not going to have, like for magnesium, you're not going to have the interveinal chlorosis and all the new growths. So basically, you should have it within 24 to 48 hours. You should see new growth starting that does not exhibit these same issues if you've corrected it. If you're in organic soil or anything that's revolving on microbiology and you know, bacteria to break down and chelate your nutrients and then uptake it to the plant, you're looking at a 7 to 14 day window where you're going to then see whatever your actions are then showing on the plant at that point. So you pretty much are always 2 weeks behind, 1 to 2 weeks behind when growing like that, and that's why people do like the you know, synthetic approach is you get results quickly. In terms of, let me go to the first part of it real quick. Different recurrencies on the same nutrient recipe, same climate, which parameters you check for first. And I mean, there's a few things that can cause it. I'm not going to lie and say I know everything when it comes to what specifically is causing that deficiency. For me, I typically get magnesium deficiencies in early flower when I have heavy feeders, because I know running, I'm not going to name names, but when running certain nutrients at a 3 EC, for those heavy feeders, it's just not enough. I have to bump it to 3.5, and then the problem it goes away at that point. There are certain things like with nutrient imbalances that if your pH is out of range or you're giving like too much of one nutrient or another, it can block the uptake of magnesium. But unless you're running your own salt mix that you've formulated yourself, most companies out there do a pretty damn good job at balancing everything properly, where you're not really going to have that issue. As long as you're pHing your nutrient between the 5, 8, and 6 range, or anywhere in or around that area, you're not going to lock yourself out of that. And you're not going to have that NPK imbalance that would cause the uptake issue. So more than likely, it's just due to the fact that you're not feeding them enough. They just need a higher balance, like everything needs to be raised equally, versus just throwing in like more magnesium into the mix. Because I know I've definitely tried to do that. I've experimented with all sorts of stuff, just giving straight, Epsom salts or whatever. I mean, you can do an Epsom foliar and get a quick benefit, but when it comes to like the actual water in the root zone, I would not try to like raise levels and stuff like that, because at that point you can start throwing things off. What would I check first though is I would say root zone EC if it was me. That would be my biggest thing because of everything I just said. Because if my EC was too low, if it wasn't at least 1 to 2 points higher than what I'm feeding at that point when I'm getting that deficiency, I would definitely step it up, as my input would be stepped up first. Not crazy amount, but I would go up another half EC or 0.5 EC, yeah, and then and see, just watch the new growth. So
Do you think that magnesium deficiency, when he's looking at the EC level, that he could maybe even have like a problem with his mix? That if he thought that he was feeding the right mixture up to that point, he might have just had his recipes wrong.
potentially, I mean, you should always be making sure that you're following the manufacturer recommendations when it comes to the balancing between whatever your base is and whatever your grow or bloom or whatever, parts that you're putting into your recipe. They've created it for, they've done the studies on it, or at least you hope they did by trusting that company that you're buying from, that they have put forth that research to make sure that everything is balanced appropriately. So as long as you're following their guide chart, like I said, I would not try and mess with that by raising, individual things. A
Yep.
lot of times you can't. Some companies, they'll run magnesium in their base. Like other companies will just run, calcium in their base, and therefore they'll group magnesium in with the grow and in with the bloom, or again, whatever type that you're supplementing with. There's also situations where some nutrients companies will recommend you do a magnesium foliar to supplement. There's just a lot of, again, I guess I would really need to get more information on what you're using and just make sure that you're mixing it appropriately. And as long as you are mixing those ratios appropriately, my recommendation would be to raise the EC overall. Like just bring everything up a little bit. At the point nowadays with what we're doing with, all these salt-based feed regimens, you're not going to hurt your plant feeding at 3.5 or 4 EC or anything like that. I mean, you're not going to burn your plant at that point. If you are, and a lot of times we're trying to stack EC. We're trying to get it way over what our input EC is. So you don't really, all it's going to do is just help you either stack faster, or it's going to get your baseline up quick. And then if you need to keep it at that baseline, you're just going to push a little bit more runoff, in that 20 to 30% range each day. And then you're going to make sure that, it doesn't continue to stack. So, I mean, I've never had a problem with a plant under 5 EC. I've never once had a plant burn even at 5 EC. If I let it, stack significantly from there or get into the 6, 7, 8 range, that's when we can start to have issues with plants that can't tolerate it. So that's always going to be my first go-to. I almost always say let's go with a ladder. I always want to get my P1 done as quick as possible because, again, I've said this before, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but in my opinion, a P1, the whole point of this phase is to go from dry to wet as fast as possible without causing excess channeling or runoff. Like I don't want to be modulating my EC via P1s, right? What I want to do is go from the absolute driest point that my substrate can get to, or that I'm allowing my substrate to get to in the very first portion of the day, up to either its field capacity or slightly under its field capacity, depending on what kind of strategy I'm trying to run at that point. So I usually go with a lot of small shots, mini small shots, usually like 3% shots, and I'll push them, 15, 20 minutes in between each one, because usually when you're running a small shot like that, it's not giving enough mLs of water that's going to actually cause that channeling effect. And it's going to allow it to get a saturation on the top, wick down. 15 minutes later, after some oxygen's got pulled in, you're going to give your another shot and just continuously fully saturate and wick throughout the substrate. Because I try to cram my P1 if I can within a 2 to 2.5 hour window, and that then allows you to use the rest of the day to either steer vegetatively or generatively and get the most out of it. So for example, if I'm trying to steer generatively, I want the longest period of time in daylight or with lights on that my plant is not getting water, so that I can actually push the heaviest dryback and that I can actually generate the most drought stress possible. Because like when the plant, like think about it, if you're out exercising or playing a sport out in the sun, that's the time when your body is craving water. You're transpiring. You're like, man, I need water right now. And when you don't get it, that's going to cause you the most stress. That's when you're going to potentially have a heat stroke or whatever else, because of dehydration that's going to happen. Obviously, we're doing this in a controlled manner where we don't actually bring the plants to a negative point, but it's the same concept where you want to put your plants in a time of stress when it really needs it. Not giving your plant water at night, it's not transpiring. It doesn't really care. It's not going to allow it stress. So I'm trying to when I'm steering generatively, I am trying to always maximize the amount of time during lights on that I'm not giving it water. And so generative steer, by cramming a P1 into a short window in the beginning, I get the maximum amount of time throughout the rest of the lights on period to do that. Or if I'm steering vegetatively, again, my P1s never change throughout the whole cycle. So that's another note there, and just to show why I do that. But I want to have the rest of the day to modulate my EC, because that's what I do with P2s a lot of the time. Like if I'm steering veg during bulk of flower, and I'm trying to keep my EC at a certain level, I can actually change the amount and the duration of those P2s to change up how much actual runoff I'm pushing throughout the day. So if I give a lot of small P2s, I'm going to push a lot more runoff, and I'm actually going to get my EC to slowly bring itself down. Versus if I only do like 1 or 2 big P2s throughout the day spaced out further, I'm only pushing a small amount of runoff because of the total time, the total of amount of shots given close to that runoff line, you know, where my field capacity is. And so that's going to actually allow my EC to rise up slowly. Again, when you modulate EC through P2s, you're always going to have gradual increases or decreases, which is usually what you want when you're trying to hover around a baseline and hold steady. It's easy to then kind of manipulate it back and forth. Yeah, that's exactly what we would expect for the most part, and that is just due to built up salts in the substrate. You know, I typically don't get that kind of crazy difference when the substrate is fresh. My first couple days of pushing water through, it's almost always going to be pretty damn close. But once you've, you know, let's just say in early flower you tried stacking EC, prevented runoff a couple days, or you've only pushed maybe 10% runoff or something. Anytime that your substrate EC is going higher than what your input feed EC is, that's due to the accumulation of salt, meaning the plant selectively uptook water. Water got transpired, you know, through just the natural environment or airflow with your substrate, and it left nutrients behind, the salts inside that substrate. Those salts build up in there, and that's actually what affects your bulk EC. That's not what we read. We read pore EC, which is the liquefied, it's the diluted version. It's basically whatever that salt content is diluted inside of water, because that's what's available to the plants. And that's also what you're getting when you push runoff. So as the runoff comes out, you're thinking you're pushing water down through the top of the plant, it's dispersing throughout, and say there's a dry pocket in the substrate where you've got like just hardened salt crystals in there that have dried out and the water has left them behind. Those now are going to get resaturated, reconstituted inside of that water, and then it's going to make its way out. And that's what flushing does, is it's essentially the water is making its way through the substrate, rehydrating and rediluting all of those those dry salt pockets, and then it's pushing it out of the bottom. So you should expect to see some amount of difference. And if you've gone through periods of time where, like, say I didn't push runoff for a week or 2 weeks even, and you know you're trying to stack your substrate EC, that first couple runoffs that you're going to push, expect to see a lot higher. Like I've seen way higher than a 2 to 3 EC difference, and that will level out over time as you bring your substrate back closer to baseline. Well, there's a lot of different ways to go about this, as with pretty much everything here. I would say, again, I don't want to preface this by being like, what type of cocoa is it, pithy or chippy? You know, how big was that clone? You know, how any of that stuff. But just as a generic response here, I would say when I typically do transplants in cocoa, I do still steer vegetatively, meaning I'm not trying to push massive drybacks. That's more so. Let's see, what's the best way to say that? That is more so tied to rockwool. Like when I'm doing rockwool, I'm doing like 10% drybacks, 10 to 15% drybacks. When I'm doing cocoa, I'm doing 15, maybe 20% drybacks max. But when I say that, I mean absolute. So you're talking relative. So in cocoa, if you had like a 50% field capacity, a 50% dryback would be 25%. I don't do that. You could do that. It's not going to cause a problem. All it's going to do is when you deprive the plant of oxygen or of when you deprive the plant of water, it causes the roots to search for water. That doesn't necessarily cause branching to occur. That causes the main tap roots that are searching for water to go down, and then you're going to start your spiraling. Because you're in uh, because you're in cocoa, that's not necessarily a huge deal because eventually those roots are going to blow up and take over the whole container. When it comes to rockwool, though, that's the last thing I want to do. I don't want, a few couple main roots coming down and then trying to go out of the bottom. So that's why I don't do huge drybacks with that. But yeah, when it comes to cocoa, you never want to overwater. So that is one thing to be cognizant of. If you got a plant that's drinking slow, which is more than likely going to occur because it's a clone and it's going into a 1 gallon, that's too big of a substrate for it to realistically, just be drinking a ton of water. But no, I wouldn't do a 50% dry back if it was me. I would cut that down a little bit. I would probably do, if we're going relative, probably like a 30% or so relative at that point, whatever would equal a hard 15 to 20% dry back. So, and again, we're just watching that. We're giving them its P1s. We're letting it dry back. We're giving them its P1s again to get back up to saturation. We're letting it dry back. And usually you're probably only going to get a few waterings in your veg cycle before you actually flip them at that point. If you're running like a 2-week veg, I would expect 3 or 4 waterings to occur. Unless you've just got you're planting teens in there and it's just a big beefy clone made out of a top or something that's just, crushing it, then obviously it's going to scale. But that's why we have sensors. The sensors are going to let you know, when did I achieve, again, I'm talking absolute here, when did I achieve that 15 to 20% dry back? Because as long as you're allowing oxygen in, you're going to be okay. I mean, you absolutely could do the 50%. It's not going to hurt anything. I just don't. I know when I give a plant when I give the plant the most water I can give it without depriving it of oxygen is when it performs the best in terms of new roots and shoots. Like, it's going to branch out, it's going to get a lot more leaves, it's going to really blow up at that point. That's why we do it in, bulk of flower. It doesn't matter where you're growing in. If you want more root growth, you need to give it oxygen. They have to have oxygen. That is why whenever you have plants in a row that are, for example, you pick up a pot and one of them will be lighter. I guarantee you could go through and look for the thickest stem, pick that block up, it's going to be lighter. And that is just that plant happened to take off faster, it happened to drink more, and therefore its substrate, because it's getting fed with all of the other plants, it stays drier than all of the others. And so when you have a drier plant, aka dry farming, it is always going to have the best root mass. Roots need oxygen, not even getting into like nutrients with like potassium, phosphorus, and all that, which obviously is what roots need to grow. Oxygen is the biggest thing. That's also why people have been experimenting with injecting DO, into their nutrient feeds as well. Is oxygen is what blasts those roots. That's another big reason why when we're steering gin in the first 3 weeks of flower, that's the time when we need to really pump out as many roots as we can to support the later swelling for the rest of flower. That's why we run dry. That's why we're always running as dry as possible, pushing big drybacks. It's just oxygen. Obviously, there's drought stress, stuff like that, but oxygen is the biggest factor there. Absolutely. Those numbers, the defaults, they will be changed in this latest update. Those were the numbers that the industry used to use a couple years ago when we were like, oh, different P1s and all that. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of different people who have a lot of different experiences out there than me. However, in my personal experience, I didn't see a big enough difference between doing anything like that. And that's why I solidify I find the most efficient P1 cycle, which, like I said, it's almost always a 3% shot. And, oh, wait, you said 1 to 3. Were you replying to a P0 there? I'm assuming that based on those numbers, potentially a P0
1
there?
to 3, it sounded like he was saying 1 to 3 for veg and 4 to
Yeah,
6
he's talking about a P0. So, sorry, my bad on that. I was thinking you were meaning a P1. It could be a P1 shot size too. regardless, I'll answer both. If it's a P1, again, I want to find the most efficient, and I found a 3% in between, which is in between all of those numbers. It's like a happy medium. It's a small enough shot to not cause, you know, excess channeling when given a whole bunch of them in concession, but it's big enough that it actually makes a difference. You know, it's going to continue to rise you up in a quick manner. So I always go with 3%, and I run that the same P1 cycle. Once I found the optimum P1, I will run that the entire duration. It doesn't matter from week 1 through week 8. It does not change. The only thing that changes is whether or not I'm running P2s and what my irrigation end times are and how big those P2s are. But when I'm changing up my steering strategies. As for a P0, if you were talking about that, because that number could also be applied to a P0 too, because we do change up those values. I actually don't really, I used to really pay attention to that a lot, and now I've prioritized circadian rhythm a lot more now, and I found that the plants, like, I think they benefit a lot more from having a schedule. They know what time they're starting. You know, we're already introducing a lot of stress to these plants. Why I don't want to make when they're getting watered, you know, another one of those things. I'm already stressing them in a lot of ways. I want to keep at least a couple things consistent and give them at least that. And so when it comes to, a lot of times I'll just run an hour after lights on, and usually that does come out to around 2 to 3%, especially once the root mass is really developed in there. Sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, but I usually will run an hour after lights on, and I less pay attention to what that number is. So when I'm running Copilot, I just prioritize my start time, and I can enter in 2% as my target value, and it really doesn't matter too much. The program's going to try to make that happen, but at the point that I've selected prioritize start time, it's going to start at that same time every day, no matter what. And if you wanted to go generative at that point, some people will bump that up to an hour and a half or 2 hours after lights on. Anywhere between an hour and 2 hours, you're totally fine. I don't think it has that much of a difference, or I don't think it makes that big of a deal. I think what's more important is that you are giving it an amount of time that the lights come on, and it starts its photosynthesis. You can actually see when the rate starts increasing again, the dryback rate. You're just basically priming the plant for that day. It's like, oh, lights have turned on, I'm dry, I don't have water, that stress begins. You know, you're basically just gauging when is it time to start watering, because you don't want to start pumping water into a plant before it's woken up yet. So you're basically looking for that dryback to see when has it started waking up, and then we're going to go ahead and hydrate from there. I would always go with Copilot, whether you use Autopilot or not. To me, it doesn't matter. Copilot's definitely the platform you should be using to set up your irrigations, not our regular rule sets. Where should you set your saturation point at? It almost always should be set at whatever your field capacity is, and that's just the point at which you turn on your drippers, it's irrigating, and that sensor stops going up in VWC. It just kind of flatlines. That's how you know every bit of water that you're putting into that substrate from then on out is just coming out of the bottom and runoff, because the substrate has hit its maximum holding capacity of liquid. And so that number is going to change. We talked about this a lot, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it a lot more, and what determining that number will be. For example, if that number is way too low when it hits that maximum point, we know we can move that probe down in the substrate a little bit and increase it, and vice versa. If it's at like 70 or 80 or something like that, we know we can move the probe up a little bit in the substrate to decrease that number. I typically, at field capacity, like to see a range between 50 and 65% at my peak saturation, depending on my substrate. And the second part of your question is if you want to allow more oxygen at the roots, typically, like I said, that is done weeks 1 through 3. That's done when we're stacking. That's done when we're steering generative. And at that point, we will actually decrease. We'll find out whatever our field capacity number is based on the sensor. And wherever that caps out at, I will usually drop it down 10 to 15% from there using our field capacity lock feature in Copilot. And that basically is just like we talked about before last week. And I'm sure we'll do a deep dive in it here soon where I can show off everything. But basically, if you go into your suggestions page, click on the advanced options and press field capacity lock, it allows you to set an artificial field capacity. So let's say you were able to get up to 60% normally. You can go ahead and set that to 45% and then just select the option to disable valves if that field capacity is reached. Save it, And then what will end up happening is it artificially drops that field capacity line. So you go through your normal P1 sequences, going all the way up, and as soon as you hit that number on a live sensor data, it kills the valve. And so it prevents you from actually reaching what your maximum field capacity is. And that means you're running drier. And when you're running drier, you've got more oxygen. There's more space for air to be held inside your substrate at that point, and therefore your root mass is going to get more oxygen and it's going to grow more in search of water. So, and just from being healthy, from having oxygenation in general. So I would definitely use Copilot. I would definitely use the field capacity lock feature if that's what you're trying to do by artificially making the substrate drier. But otherwise, your saturation point should be set at what your actual fuel capacity is. And if that number is out of whack, out of 50 to 65%, we need to adjust the probe's height slightly up or down to make that happen, because that's where most substrates, both cocoa and rockwool, should be sitting at. Yeah, I mean, you can stack. That's a beautiful thing about rockwool is you can stack it in whatever configuration you want. Most people will veg in like a 4x4 or a delta, then they'll stack it either on a slab, a pillow, or a 6x6 or a jumbo, or I mean, any of the different sizes. They'll then stack it on once the roots have sufficiently made its way through the 4x4. In your case, that's, I mean, I don't know how long you're vegging for, but it says you're flipping after 10 days. So that's what that means. 10 days, putting a clone straight to 6x6, it's rare that you need to stack at that point because it's over drying unless you're, like we talked about earlier, usually people are having the opposite thing happen where they're like, shit, I'm not drying enough. I'm not getting a big enough dry back. So if you are over drying there, we got to define what is over drying for one, and two, what's your definition of over drying? If you're talking about wilting, that's kind of crazy. I want the strain that you have, but in terms of trying to figure that out, I would need to know what it is, what your definition of over drying is, and like let's see what's going on in there. But you could technically take that 6x6 and put it on a pillow. You could put it on a fucking mom, one of those big 8x8s, the big mamas. You could put it on a lot of different things. You could even stack it on a slab if you want. They even make these little cocoa pads too that are like fiber pads that I've seen people stack them onto. I don't really like those, but they do work. But they're about an inch thick, and they're like these little Brillo pads, kind of like one of them sponges that you can polish and buff things with. They have those as well. But I'd be interested to know, kind of see exactly what was going on there and that you're having an issue like that in the beginning. Well, in ripening, that's the final, like usually 2 weeks of flower when we are steering gen. You usually, I mean, a lot of people, we do want a little bit of an increase in EC to go along with the drybacks. But yeah, if you want to not do that, that's totally fine. The way you would do that in Copilot is going to be, I will almost always just default to a 30% dryback and just let the program figure out how many, because at that point I need P2s, even if I'm pushing a 30% dryback usually. So if I have to cut off 2 or 3 P2s, that's fine. I'll let the program, cut them out like midday or whatever, and then hit my 30% dryback as my number one priority. And then what you can actually do is use the fuel capacity lock. I'm sorry. I take that back. My bad. I thought it was the other thing around you want to increase EC. If you want to keep it low EC, but still maintain your dryback, you just need to give a shitload more P2s during that time. So like your irrigation in time is going to be shifted, like when your last P2 was, forward and backwards to hit your 30% dryback, or if you want to do 40%, whatever it happens to be at that point. But the time window that you're giving P2s, let's just say it's like 2 or 3 hours, instead of giving a couple shots spaced out, by 45 to an hour, go ahead and give a bunch of really small shots. So like maybe 45-second shots or so, usually whatever a 1 to 2% shot by volume would be. And you're going to give those very frequently. I mean, if you really wanted to keep your EC low and continue to flush things out, you would give 10, 15 shots, however much you want during that time frame. Because you got to think, once you get up to your field capacity, via P1s and you're at that field capacity line, every shot that you give once you're at that line is going to runoff at that point. And that's how you keep EC low, is pushing more runoff. So if I was to give 20 tiny P1 shots, even though they're tiny, 80 to 90% of that volume of water that you're putting in is going straight out the bottom at that point. It's flushing everything out. So the more of those you give, even though they're small, they're going to add up to a lot more runoff. And so that's how I would do it there, is I would knock my P2s back, find my irrigation in time so that I hit 30%, and then the time frame of my P2s, I would make them very small but very frequent shots to equate to more runoff.